Well, it's a pleasure always to be in Tennessee. It's one of the places where I say people have common sense, and we don't see that everywhere. But this whole Opportunity Zone project endeavor is such a joy to me because we live in a very prosperous country, and we live in a place where there really is not a reason to have areas that are depressed, areas of homelessness, areas of hopelessness and desperation. You know, we have always been a country where people were willing to reach out and help each other. And I'm reminded of a time when we were being criticized by Europe because, you know, we had some very wealthy people, Vanderbilts and Rockefellers, Kellogg's, Fords, Carnegie's, Mellons, and you had a lot of poor people, and they said you can't run a country like that. You have to have an overarching government that redistributes everything appropriately. But what they didn't really realize is all of those names and many others in this country, instead of just hoarding money like they did in Europe and in other places and passing it down from generation to generation, they actually got involved in the infrastructure of our country. And they built the Transcontinental Railroad and the seaports and the textile mills and the factories that allowed for the creation of the most powerful and dynamic middle class the world has ever seen, which rapidly propelled us to the pinnacle of the economic world. But they didn't stop there. They also built schools and universities and museums and libraries and the stuff of the American dream. And that's what we need to remember, that we're all in this together, and that if we're willing to work together, it is almost unimaginable what's going to be done. You know, this morning I was in South City looking at the first phase of the development of the Choice Neighborhood program there. Beautiful. Went inside one of the apartments. The woman had been back in there for 3 weeks now, was absolutely on cloud nine. And I've seen these redevelopments all over the country now. These are things that we are completely capable of doing through public-private partnerships. And that's what this whole Opportunity Zone thing is about, public-private partnerships. You know, revitalization of America, it's not just the job of the federal government, it's not just the job of the state government, it's not just the job of the local government, it's not just the job of the nonprofits or the for-profits or the faith-based community, but when everybody works together, this is what can happen. And it thrills my heart when I see things like this. I know this is going to be highly successful, and what this will do is it will stimulate more activity elsewhere. One of the wonderful things about the Opportunity Zones is the incentive is long-term. You know, you leave your investment in there for 5 years, you get the first major tax benefit, 7 years, you get the next one, 10 years, you get a really big one. And if you have that kind of long-term incentive, you're not just going to make an investment and walk away. You're going to be really interested in return on investment. So you're going to continue to be interested in that area, continue to get involved in what's going on in that area. Those are the kinds of things that really make an area thrive. And when we talk about Opportunity Zones, dissect that word. The last 5 letters are unity. And that's what I see in a lot of these places. Republicans, Democrats, governors, senators, House of Representatives, state senators, as we see here today, all working together. And, you know, I think the biggest threat to our country right now is disunity. And people convincing us that we're each other's enemies. We're not each other's enemies. The enemies are like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and people who want to destroy. It's not the next door neighbor who happens to have a different opinion about how something is done. And we in America have got to become much smarter than that and not allow ourselves to be diverted into these silly arguments and start working together. And I think if we do that, there are very few problems that we cannot resolve.
Okay, so raise your hand if you have questions. She's got a mic she'll bring to you. Any questions?
Jacob from the corner.
In the corner?
Caroline down there.
Caroline, morning.
Mr. Secretary, in Memphis, there's a problem with a lot of the housing being available. There's a lot of housing, but the affordable stuff is very low quality, and evictions are rising. What are ways that your administration is trying to change or fix those two problems?
Well, you know, the affordable housing situation is actually a crisis in this country. And interestingly enough, there seems to be a very strong correlation between the regulatory burden and the amount of homelessness and the difficulty people have of being able to obtain and buy homes. The cost of some of the regulations, the density regulations, the parking regulations, the historic preservation regulations, wetlands, the various other environmental things, all of which are important in the proper proportion. But when they become overwhelming, they drive the prices. That coupled with the fact that there is a tendency for people not to want to have affordable housing developments in their neighborhood. NIMBYism, not in my backyard. And I completely sympathize with NIMBYs because the most valuable asset that most people have is their home, and the last thing they want is to see it deteriorate. But the NIMBYism is really based on old thinking that the government still, as they used to, rides in on a white horse with a big bucket of money and builds these massive multifamily things with little forethought, afterthought, or interim thought. And they deteriorate, they become the nidus for crime and all kinds of undesirable activities. And of course that impacts the neighborhood. Newsflash, the government doesn't do that anymore. Now we're talking about public-private partnerships. We're talking about much smaller multifamily developments. We're not talking about putting them in the middle of a block of single-family homes, but we're talking about putting them in appropriate places where they match the architecture and the culture of the area so that nurses and firemen and police and teachers can live in the same neighborhood where they work, which only enhances the value, and where we can have subsidized housing. You know, interestingly enough, we've recently done a survey of landlords and why they were reluctant to accept housing choice vouchers. And in many cases, it was because they felt that the Section 8 tenants would destroy their property. Now, what the mayor in San Diego and his city council did to alleviate that anxiety, they told all the landlords that the city would pay for any damage that was done. And the opposition melted, and it cost the city almost nothing because people weren't destroying their property. That was a perception, a misperception. But you know, when we deal with the issues that are facing us, we have to deal with reality and we have to deal with perception too. And if we do that, eventually the misperceptions go away.
But evictions, how are you combating rising evictions? Is that a problem you're concerned with?
Well, of course we're concerned with evictions, and what we do, particularly in private housing with evictions, is we ask the servicers, the actual lenders, to go through a checklist, a waterfall of items to make sure that people aren't being prematurely and improperly evicted. It's very important, though, for us to recognize that the reason for a lot of evictions that have occurred in the past is because we had policies For instance, not federal policies, but policies that were tolerated, where people got engaged in inappropriate types of lending, inappropriate evaluations of debt to income, put people in very untenable situations where they were not able to meet the financial requirements. We're looking very carefully at those things before you reach the stage of being evicted. That's the critical place where we can make a big difference. Because this is something that just happened this week, the launch of opportunityzones.gov. And you can find out about each of the opportunity zones, what's going on in them, what are the opportunities in each one of them.
Because, for example, I live by the University of Memphis, and so people are kind of wondering, like on my Facebook page, you know that there's one in that area, so it's like, what does that mean for us? What's going to happen in that area?
Right, and you can hone down on the webpage directly to that one, find out what's going on there, who are the people in that area to contact. It's very, very friendly. Just mention that there are 8,761 opportunity zones in the country. 40% of them are in rural areas, and a significant number are in suburban areas. So remember that the opportunity zones were designated not by the federal government, but by the governor of each state and the 5 territories and Washington, D.C. So they did that in consultation with state representatives who actually know where the need is. And again, recognize that there are a number of incentives that are built into opportunity zones which apply to all the areas where they exist. Those incentives apply to suburban, exurbs, as well as rural areas as well.
What percent?
Well, I think Memphis is making a very good start. And as I said before, this is not a Democrat or Republican problem. You know, you look at the faces of those people who are out there, and you see a hollow look, a look of hopelessness in many cases. About 40% of homeless people in this country either have mental problems or are drug addicted. That has to be factored into the equation. And a lot of people who have mental problems actually can function if they're getting appropriate counseling and medications and they're being monitored. They don't have to be institutionalized. Some do. Some people who are dangerous to themselves and to others. And with the drug rehabilitation, it has to be factored in that it doesn't take very long for the changes to occur in a person's brain when they become drug addicted. That can occur in a matter of weeks. But in order to reverse those changes, it generally takes somewhere between 12 and 18 months. So that means that it's not just a matter of housing, it's a matter of looking at their health needs. And that's why we're attacking this on a multi-agency level with HHS and other 13 agencies involved so we can take care of those problems. The government has made available special funding to deal with the mental issues. Some states have not taken advantage of it yet. Tennessee has taken advantage of it and is on the right track.
Do you have any comments?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I think you're probably referring to the New York Times article. I don't want to tell you what I really think about that article, but I will tell you that the property values in opportunity zones are increasing at about 20% as opposed to 10% outside of opportunity zones. And who owns that property? In most cases, the low-income people who live there. 35 million Americans live in opportunity zones. Not only that, but you see an economy that has improved significantly. People's 401ks, it doesn't matter where you live, your 401ks still go up. We are rectifying the Section 3 requirements of the Fair Housing Act now, which says that if you're getting HUD money, you have to hire, train, or give contracts to the low-income people in that area. It's been on the books for 50 years, hardly been used because it's cumbersome. We've rewritten it so that it becomes much easier to use because we want the people who live in those areas to be involved. You know, we're talking about, you know, enormous amount of money in this Opportunity Zone project. And if we can employ the people who live here and give them real skills, what a difference that makes. You know, I was down at an Opportunity Zone in Florida recently and saw some of the young men who lived in the area that was, you know, just rampant with crime and poverty. But they had gotten jobs through Section 3 installing windows. And one of them had started his own company. I found the same thing in Wisconsin. Those are the kinds of things that allow people to actually come out of poverty. That's what we're really looking to do here, to spread the wealth. And there is no question that people who make investments in these zones will realize some financial gain from that. But we must be practical and recognize that people who have money to invest are going to invest money. So why not induce them to invest that money in places that traditionally are economically neglected and allow those people also to benefit?